Hello to all the listeners of the Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by the Institute of European Rights, a think tank based in Vilnius. In the Right Mind podcast, we discuss various topics spanning from political theory to international affairs. Today, we're going to talk about Germany, its view on the world, and its view on Russia. The timing of a podcast is rather symbolic, since we are recording the podcast on December 18th. And today, German and Lithuanian defense ministers signed a German military brigade deployment plan, and that is indeed a very important step forward. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce today's guest, John Lough, who is an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Chatham House. In 2021, John Lough wrote a book called Germany's Russia Problem, which was published by Manchester University Press. A year ago, the book was updated following Russia's war against Ukraine. John, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
John is visiting Vilnius in parallel with the Lithuanian-German forum that is taking place today in Lithuanian Parliament. Our conversation will focus on the book that John Lough has authored. The book deals with various aspects of the German relations vis-a-vis Russia, starting from a weight of history, going on to the horrors of the middle of the 20th century, moving on to Ostpolitik, the reunification of Germany, and the most detailed part of the book covers the past 30 years of German policy towards Russia and various aspects of this policy, economy, energy, culture, etc. Personally, I really enjoyed reading the book. I found it very stimulating, so I really looked forward for this conversation. If I may, I would like to for our listeners to give one quote from your book, from the introduction part of your book. And now I quote: "German quest for strategic partnership with Russia inadvertently ended up supporting the emergence of a Russian regime hostile to its interests and values. In other words, its policy did not just fail, it was counterproductive. It legitimized and reinforced a deeply corrupt and increasingly authoritarian and repressive Russian system, emboldening it to deploy force against its neighbors and to attack Western institutions." This is quite strong words. So we'll try to explore German views and policies towards Russia and various phenomena surrounding it. And my first question would be, could you please introduce our listeners, what is your background with dealing with working and dealing with Germany and Russia? You have spent at least a couple of years in Moscow working in various positions. So what is your professional background and sort of an intellectual background working with Germany and Russia?
Well, let's start with the personal background. I had the great fortune to study German and Russian at university. And this was because it was a Cambridge education. It was largely German and Russian literature. And I think this is such an important aspect of the relationship between Germany and Russia, this cultural relationship. So that was how I became initially interested in the subject. And I remember a key moment for me at university when I had to write a horribly difficult essay about a Dostoevsky novel, Biesi, the Devils. And I struggled to find some what we call in the business secondary literature to try to explain to me what the Devils was really about. And I remember going to the university library in Cambridge, and I found a source in German about the Devils, and it completely opened my eyes to the subject matter. And I took this back to the rather fearsome Russian lady who supervised me for the Dostoevsky paper in my final year at Cambridge. And she said to me, "You have discovered something very important. Carry on looking at it, because Germany has a special relationship with Russia." So that was really where I started. And this journey took me then into the worlds of diplomacy and politics. I spent 7 years working for NATO. I was the first NATO official to be based in Moscow, starting in the mid-1990s. And as luck would have it, NATO didn't in those days have its own office, and we had to kind of camp out in an embassy. So I spent 1 year at the French embassy and nearly 2 years based at the German embassy. And so I was able to look at what Germany was doing in Russia from this vantage point in the German embassy. And for me, it was an absolutely fascinating experience and rather formative. And in later years, I worked for BP's joint venture in Russia, a company called TNK BP. And one of my assignments there was to speak to the German government. We maintained contacts with various European governments because the nature of the oil and gas business is very political. You have to go and talk to other countries. And so I had a very good insight there into German government thinking about Russia, industry in general, the way it approached Russia. So I gathered this experience in different forms. And then, I became involved with a think tank at Chatham House and took a possibly sort of more academic view of this relationship. We were invited occasionally to go and meet with our German counterparts. The British government was keen to have experts contribute to discussions between London and Berlin, which in those days when I started doing that was probably in the aftermath of the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. Some of those conversations we had with the German side were difficult because we seemed to interpret the situation differently. We would basically agree on the facts, but the interpretation was very different. And I felt that I had, when those discussions were underway, I had some kind of insight into the way the Germans were thinking. And over the years, I'd been wanting to write this book actually for a long time. But I got lucky with my timing because I wrote it during COVID, when there was a bit more time to reflect. And I was able to go more deeply into some of the history that I wanted to uncover. And so a large chunk of the book at the beginning, as you have seen, deals with 300 years of German-Russian history, which I think to try to understand today's situation and what drives German policy, you have to have an appreciation of that. But the question I was trying to really answer for myself was, why did Germany, with this very deep relationship, this sophisticated understanding of Russia, an appreciation of Russia's importance as a country in Europe, why did it get its policy so badly wrong? Why did it remain in denial for so long about the nature of the system that was emerging in Russia? So that was the kind of question I set for myself to answer.
And indeed, you give a very huge part of your book to history and that context that Germany and Russia had since the at least 17th century. And could you elaborate on that? What needs to be understood and known about these long span German-Russo context and relations? What is the key things one has to know about the historical context between both two cultures and two political entities? That, of course, the forms of these political entities varied between the years in great variety. But what needs to be understand about this historical aspect of a question?
I think what we have to understand is that these histories are intertwined. And they go back a long way in terms of the contacts, at least between Germans and Russians as peoples. And if you think back to the days of Peter the Great, and indeed earlier, Germans were brought to the Russian lands because they had certain skills and they were able to apply them successfully. We have this phenomenon of the Baltic, the German nobility that was then incorporated into the Russian imperial bureaucracy, again bringing these administrative skills, technical skills, the huge influence of Germany on the education system in Russia, on the military system. Even on the emergence of the development of the Russian language. People forget this. And there are some striking similarities between the languages, but it was German scholars in some cases who were responsible for developing established rules of grammar in Russian. And so it's easy to forget that these these sort of underpinnings exist between the two cultures. You think then about the cultural exchange. German literature, philosophy, music went one way, and rather later, Russian, in 19th century literature, particularly music and ideas, came the other way. The ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were then incorporated in a certain way in Russia, which led to the establishment of the Soviet regime. You think about then the role Germany played in putting Lenin on a train back to Russia at the time. It's been at times a very close, intimate relationship. And then, of course, 20th century history, we've seen these violent extremes, and the fact that both countries could become violent in different ways. I found it just extraordinary the way the German army after Versailles ended up breaking those commitments, and joint training centers with the Red Army, other practices, the fact that the Gestapo learned from techniques of the Soviet security services. They point to this just very deep relationship, and I think somehow an admiration for the other, because if I can put it crudely, and it's a generalization, but sometimes generalizations are useful. The Russians feel the Germans have something that they don't, and those were probably their superior organizational, their engineering skills. And equally, the Germans feel that the Russians have something that they don't, which is maybe this emotional space. It's their spontaneity. The perceived warmth of their soul. Somehow, to both sides, the other is something of an enigma, is different, but they have a quality that kind of reinforces their own characteristics or complements them. So that probably is a factor. And then the experience, of course, the Red Army and its Western allies defeating Hitler's Germany has given even the Russian leadership today this sense of a extraordinary historical achievement, which it was unquestionably, and one achieved with the most phenomenal sacrifice. But around it, this notion is built up, and particularly in Germany, that it was Russians who suffered the most as a result of Hitler's invasion, and which, of course, is a historical distortion. Because if you look at the numbers killed and where the destruction took place, it wasn't actually on the territory of today's Russian Federation itself. It was more in Ukraine and Belarus. But that's an interpretation of history that has perhaps been imposed on Germans and was a factor in their kind of conditioning and the way they wanted to seek a normal, as they saw it, peaceful relationship with Russia, one based on trust, on common interest, in which they felt after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, that there would be that space for the common interest to emerge and for this greater Europe to take shape. And Germans feel quite strongly that, or have felt until February the 24th, 2022, that there was a place for Russia in Europe, and that it was in Europe's interest to integrate Russia to the maximum degree possible, because you could ultimately, in the view of people who believed in this idea, you could only have security with Russia and not against it. And that, of course, points to a short-term memory, because we had security against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and quite effectively. I mean, it wasn't especially comfortable, but the system worked, remained secure, and at the end of the day, Western economic and military power was sufficient to defeat the Soviet Union in peacetime.
I'm really happy that you gave this huge brush of a historical perspective, but I wanted to stick on one point during the Cold War and what implications it has on today. It seems to me that today, when we talk about Germany, we often think of it as a completely unitary state culture. You mentioned in your book that East German society, the former Deutsche Demokratie Republik, has a slightly different attitude towards Russia. And when we talk about the DDR memory culture, we sometimes use this word. This word is used sometimes, nostalgie, the special nostalgia for that East German period. What should one specifically know about the integration of East Germany into the larger Germany in 1990s, and the attitudes of East German societies and lands that it has on Russia today?
Well, let's remember, first of all, that Germany is a federal republic.
Yeah.
And its regions have strong identities. And the identities of the Eastern Länder are quite specific. And even today, despite the fact that we are, how many years on, almost 35 years on since the collapse of the GDR, there are attitudes in those regions among a segment of the population, which is admittedly becoming a lot older now. This is the older generation. Those attitudes have remained and in some ways perhaps been reinforced by the fact that many people from those parts of the countries feel that they were disadvantaged when Germany reunited, that they were somehow not treated with the respect that they deserved, that they have a view of the world that they believe is valid. And these were people who grew up influenced, of course, very heavily by Russian Soviet culture, if I can put it that way, who saw the Soviet Union as the big brother, a supposedly friendly brother, who grew up with a different version of history of who won the war and how the war was won and what the outcome was. And it's not altogether surprising that those people would have still, I suppose, some lingering attitudes of respect for Russian culture, a sense that they have, because they were close to the Russians, they have a better understanding of who they are and how to treat them. Mm-hmm. And I think it's probably an effort on the part of some in those regions to kind of assert themselves and say, please take us seriously. We have experience and you're disregarding it. And so this notion in some parts of Eastern Germany, you must never anger the Russians, never annoy them because they can react strongly or even violently. I mean, I think that's something that's embedded. And, after all, the GDR had its experience of 1953 and the workers, uprising. We all know how that was put down. So I think there was a strong view that you have to respect the Russians, you have to understand their mentality, and there is a way of working with them, but you've got to find that common language. Let us remember also that there were plenty of people who studied in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and who speaks Russian, for example. Speak
Russian, built those relationships. And, today we find that the Alternative für Deutschland and, what's left of the Die Linke party, despite their different ends of the political spectrum,
they collide.
When it comes to Russia, they seem to have some views in common.
Absolutely.
It's quite extraordinary. Yeah. And some of those people who studied in the Soviet Union have gone on to make very good careers and bring a mindset and a certain level of experience, which is not to be ignored.
Mm. The other phenomenon that I want to talk about is Ostpolitik. I'm sure that our listeners needs no introduction what was the Ostpolitik, the paradigm of Ostpolitik. But I would like to ask how the present German establishment in politics, in academia, in culture, in economy view of the Ostpolitik. What is the surrounding mythologies around the Ostpolitik as such?
Well, I think the main mythology exists in the social democratic circles, because this was an SPD policy, and in fact, perhaps the only really successful example of a distinctive social democrat foreign policy. And it took shape in the late 1960s, developed by Willy Brandt, the later chancellor, and Egon Bahr. And its goal was the long-term overcoming of division in Germany. And it was a slow, patient policy, but it was one that was based on West Germany's membership of NATO, of strong defenses, and the idea that there was room for dialogue with the Soviet Union if it was conducted in the right way. And of course, it turned out over time to be successful in relaxing tensions. And it was, I suspect, the basis for ultimately the appearance of a set of reform policies in the Soviet Union that were very radical, and far more radical than anybody could have expected. But it also created great discomfort occasionally for the SPD party and the architects of this policy. If you think of the appearance of or the development of solidarity in Poland, and the instincts of those in charge at the time that one needed to deal, in fact, with the communist authorities in Poland rather than with the solidarity opposition. So there were difficult moments there, but arguably the Soviet Union wouldn't have embarked on such radical reform policies under Gorbachev if there had not been the basis for a more predictable relationship with the West, which is what the Helsinki Final Act in particular provided. So you could argue that it was an important achievement, but to say that it was the reason why Gorbachev came to power and why ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed is I think a significant exaggeration of what it achieved. But there is nevertheless, I think, some of those people in power today, including Chancellor Scholz and those around him, people thinking about foreign policy, they are very influenced by how that policy was conducted, what they believe it achieved, and they're feeling that there is no alternative at the end of the day to dialogue with Moscow, and to finding some form of accommodation where both sides feel that there can be a modus vivendi. Mm-hmm. But it's an oversimplification, I think, that attitude of what Ostpolitik in fact involved. It was born out of a specific set of historical circumstances, and it ultimately we got lucky with the collapse of the Soviet Union for a whole, I would say,
reasons.
Set of reasons that went far beyond what the architects of that policy had originally designed.
One name and one person I was surprised of that you mentioned in the book is Volker Rue, the Helmut Kohl's government defense minister, and I'm quite sure that the name is not that known in Lithuania, and I assume in wider region. What was his role in the 90s in the development of the idea of NATO's enlargement, and basically what was his role in the wider context of the geopolitics in the early 90s?
I personally think that Volker Rue's influence is much underestimated on the development of NATO security policy in the 1990s, because he was one of the first people to recognize that Poland had the same right to security as United Germany, Why should it feel any less secure? Why should its aspiration to join NATO be simply disregarded because, NATO wasn't prepared to think about enlargement? So he was the one who commissioned the first serious study of NATO enlargement. He persuaded Chancellor Kohl that it needed to be raised, the issue needed to be raised with the American side, so they took it to Bill Clinton. The Americans at that stage, this was around 1993, were not enthusiastic about enlarging NATO. It really wasn't on the agenda at that point, but it quickly moved on to the agenda. The Americans had in mind probably some sort of interim mechanism that was known at the time as the Partnership for Peace, established in 1994. And the Poles and other Central European countries regarded this as some kind of halfway house that for them posed a danger because it meant they could maybe permanently accommodated in this halfway house, together with Russia and a whole set of other countries. So Ruhr's intervention had a profound effect because it helped legitimize these aspirations of the Central European countries. It quickly put the issue of enlargement on NATO's agenda. NATO published its so-called study on enlargement in 1995 that really established the new membership criteria, if you will. And then by 1997, there was then a decision taken to admit Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. So the issue moved very quickly. But people tend to forget that there was a very strong German factor here, because the Germans concluded that it was better to have Poland in NATO, for example, rather than find themselves on the front line. That this made them feel more secure in the process. So it was taking this Western security culture east. And I think ultimately the Americans were persuaded that it was important for the Germans to have that greater degree of security, to recognize that they were no longer that country on the front line. And of course, ultimately this gave Poland exactly what it needed to deal with its anxiety about its security environment. Now, those who argue, of course, and there's a great debate about this still in Western circles about whether this is the kind of original sin in Western foreign policy making after 1991, and if we hadn't had NATO enlargement, then the Russians would have behaved very differently. And that's a view personally that I don't. They might have behaved differently, but not in a way that would have enhanced the security of Central Europe and Western Europe.
Yeah. The one thing is that when we think about and when we calculate Germans sort of German today's German policy, we understand that Germany is the economic giant of Europe. But my question is, what is the German economic players' impact and role in drafting Germany's policy vis-a-vis Russia in the past 30 years? I assume of course, in any country, economic players have their say in the government strategy as such. But is there something specifically that what needs to be known about the German economic players' role in German policy towards Russia in the past, generally after 1990s?
It's a well-known fact that German industry was very keen to have a cheap and, as they saw it, reliable source of energy. So the gas relationship became extremely important. And gas had been one of the tools of Ostpolitik in developing trade relationships as a way of diffusing security tensions. And you can certainly make an argument that during the height of the Cold War, that gas connection, the oil and gas exports from the Soviet Union to Western Europe were never put in question. The energy flowed. And this bred this sort of determinist thinking in Germany that so long as we have an expanded energy relationship with Russia, things are going to be okay, even if the security problems become larger. We still have that underpinning to our relationship. And this led in through the 1990s and for the best part of 25 years to the expansion of that relationship. And the physical manifestation of it was, of course, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And I know that was bitterly opposed here in Lithuania, and strong representations were made by Lithuania and neighboring countries to the German side. But German government really didn't want to listen to those arguments because it felt it knew better. And, of course, was proved, conclusively wrong that Russia was prepared to cut off the gas. It wasn't prepared to moderate its behavior to preserve that relationship. So that was undoubtedly a big factor. At the same time, German industry, and this is an instinct that goes back well over 100 years, saw Russia as not just a place from which you export raw materials or you import raw materials, but rather it's a ready market for high quality German goods, particularly machine tools, cars, other fine products of German engineering. So this has been part of this sort of historical trade relationship. If you go back, 100 plus years, you'd find the structure of trade is actually very similar, except that Russia at the time was exporting grain rather than energy. But in terms of German goods that were going into Russia, very much the same.
Raw materials versus high quality goods.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, it's an absolute natural exchange. And at the time, particularly during the Schröder years, German industry was keen to discover a growing market. It was believed that looking at the size of Russia, 140 million people, the underdevelopment of that market, that there were great opportunities. So there's no question that some German companies during that period did extremely good business in Russia, and that breeds a lobby of people who are interested in the preservation of that relationship. There was a kind of almost sort of golden age in German-Russian relations, particularly after 2000. German policymakers believed that with a German-speaking president who clearly had respect for German culture, who spoke the language really pretty well, that they'd sort of entered this period in which I remember a German diplomat saying to me that at the time we have our best relations for 100 years. And it was all, sort of too good to be true. I remember personally going to an investment conference where Gerhard Schröder spoke down in Stuttgart.
Still being a chancellor.
He was still chancellor, talking about the Russian market. And this was a business conference, and the optimism in the room at the time was so huge, such enthusiasm, and I think just the level of satisfaction with the way this relationship was developing. And that would have been around, 2004. So it was a time when Putin, during his first term, enacted some of these liberal economic policies that had been designed actually in the Yeltsin years, but were then implemented and coincided with the rise of commodity prices. And there was this, sense that the Russian economy was taking off again, that Putin and those people around him were committed to further economic reform, and that if you had a prosperous economy, then that was going to deal with some of the political problems in the country, because you would have an expanded middle class. This logic, the kind of the Washington consensus logic, and Germany didn't apply this logic just to Russia; it was also to China. You can see similar things, and the US did the same to China. So it was a period of great optimism, where I think German policymakers felt that their policies were being vindicated. And they then got into this cycle of thinking that it's not as bad as some people say it is. The underlying trend's still positive because the economy is growing, business is growing, and if we use that as the indicator of our relations, then we're kind of on track. And that was partly the reason why I think the German establishment became just blind or deaf to the signals that were coming out of Russia, that were becoming increasingly clear, that you really couldn't ignore. But somehow German policymakers put their head in the sand and said this is going to be okay. And if we fast forward to 2014, the annexation of Crimea, where in many ways I feel that Chancellor Merkel understood absolutely everything about what was going on at the time, saw the dangers as well, but within the constraints of a coalition, she'd agreed to abandon nuclear power after the Fukushima events. So they were building a dependency on gas supplies from elsewhere. They didn't have the infrastructure to develop to import liquefied natural gas, LNG. So Russia became this bigger factor. Therefore, industry was lobbying for Nord Stream 2, excuse me. And it just took on a logic of its own, that it seemed to be, even she felt that if you had Nord Stream 2, that might be an investment in securing the relationship and keeping things under control, ensuring that despite Russia's actions in Ukraine and its seizure of territory, its violation of so many agreements, from the Helsinki Final Act through to the Charter of Paris, and a real serious breach of international law, which Budapest Memorandum, yes, Germans as their very sort of legalistic mindset were very conscious of and offended by. Even they, and I think even Chancellor Merkel felt that this expansion of the gas relationship or the energy relationship is necessary as a way of stabilizing the situation with Russia.
But you would say that she was constrained by the environment, policymaking environment, and in general.
Well, she was certainly constrained by it, but she was responsible as well for being constrained by it, because you can argue it wasn't strictly speaking necessary for Germany to rush headlong into the abandonment of nuclear power without looking at more seriously at the consequences of that. But because this whole issue of security of supply, for example, of Germany seemed to be more of a matter for industry than for government, because it was viewed in very technical terms rather than considering its geopolitical consequences and the fact that you might be giving Russia an additional lever to manipulate German politics. Because it quickly could become a divisive issue. So I think they played straight into the hands of the Russian side, and underestimated the appetite of the Kremlin to achieve certain objectives in Ukraine. Now, I would say that where I agree with Chancellor Merkel is that the sanctions policy that she championed at the time was, by EU standards, was quite radical. And she wanted to go further than that, but just couldn't deliver it because of the need to find consensus within the EU. And so I think she knew that on their own, those sanctions were pinpricks, but important pinpricks. And the Russians were undoubtedly unhappy about some of them. But in terms of acting as a constraint against further destabilization of Ukraine, they were clearly insufficient. But they may have given the Russians reason to pause for thought. And we were lucky in the sense that Russia got distracted by Syria.
In 2015 and beyond.
Yes. And that gave Ukraine, I think, a little bit of time and space to conduct some quite meaningful reforms, including in the area of defense and security, cleaning up of the armed forces, which, of course, had not fought in 2014, the some change of personnel, certainly within the security services, that have been
clearing up the system itself,
penetrated by the Russian side. And those years, I think, proved to be absolutely crucial in helping Ukraine establish the level of resilience that it has demonstrated over the last 2 years. Things like the decentralization reform, some of the public sector, the reforms, the decision that was taken to stop buying gas from Russia. A lot of important things took place during that period that in fact made the country much, much stronger. So if the Russians had come back, for example, within 18 months and had another go at Ukraine, I think that Ukraine would have been really struggling. Yeah. But that wasn't the case. But I and no doubt others look forward to Angela Merkel's memoirs that I believe are going to appear in 2024 to see what she says
must
about,
be interesting.
Yeah, about that period in particular.
Coming back to Germany, of course, we talk that the popular word is Zeitenwende, the turning points of Germany's foreign and defense policy. And do you think that this strategic shift in German defense and foreign policy is irreversible? Could the German domestic political situation turn in such a way that it could revert the German defense and foreign policy in a status quo ante that has been in 2021?
I think it would take an extreme event in Russia for that to happen. And let us say if President Putin had an accident tomorrow, Prime Minister Mishustin took over, and with his authorities as acting head of state was then able to dismiss the defense minister, the head of the FSB, and take a series of decisions that indicated that Russia wished to bring the war to an immediate end in Ukraine, then I think there would be several Western governments that would be struggling to work out how to respond to that. And I think we might see in that instance in Germany a re-emergence of, let's say, an approach focused on accommodation. And trying to make the best out of that situation. I think it would reawaken instincts among certain members of the strategic community and within the policy-making apparatus itself. But since that's an extreme scenario, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Certainly over the next 10 years, I think we will see a change of leadership in Russia. But in the meantime, Germany and its allies, have to digest the fact that Russia has not turned out to be the country we wished it to be, that it's demonstrating many aspects of its traditional behavior in Europe, and its desire to disrupt, to weaken security structures that emerge as countries in the region seek to build defenses against Russia, seeing the opportunity for the United States to perhaps retreat further from Europe, be less interested in Europe, and this, I think, sophisticated Russian understanding of the degree to which international affairs are now in a state of revolutionary upheaval. That they, or I should say a state of upheaval, which they can use then to create a revolutionary situation. And that this might lead to I suppose, a sort of reorganization of the principles of the operating principles of international affairs, giving Russia, its allies, the global south, I don't like that term personally, but as a shorthand we can use it, a greater level of influence. So you can see the game that they are playing. They're extremely ambitious, and it seems to be kind of all or nothing. But there's no doubt they've taken an extraordinary risk in the case of Ukraine, and it's one that I'm quite certain will historically backfire on them, because they have so spectacularly alienated a country that could, at the very least, have been relatively friendly towards them, because of the degree of mutual understanding, the intermarriages, the cultural and other links between them. It was not a foregone conclusion that there was going to be, a level of hostility between Russia and Ukraine if, Russia had simply accepted that, Ukraine existed in these borders and they could have a good relationship, and that would be the compensation for the fact that they'd lost direct influence over, that region of the former Soviet Union and of their historical space. There are other countries in the world that have been through, a period of decolonization, and mine included, and it does change the way you think about the world, but it doesn't mean to say that you automatically have bad relations with those countries of your former colonies. Yeah. But Russia, for the complicated reasons that we know about, has proved unable to do that. And so I think that, for Germany and others is a very maybe distressing outcome, because 30 years ago people were very much more optimistic about the course that Russia might take. But there were also, those who I think understood that in historical terms Russia wasn't going to be out of the picture for a long period. If it was down on its knees in the 1990s, it was probably going to get up and start pushing its weight around fairly quickly. But it was a minority of people who, I think, understood that and had that greater knowledge. And one thing I tend to think today, when I look at particularly European governments and the sort of policy-making apparatus in various countries, I don't have a sense that people have a sort of strong understanding of European history and how those years, decades, immediately after the end of the Cold War were exceptional, when it seemed possible to dream about, a Europe whole and free without conflict. I mean, that's just not been Europe's experience. The relationships between countries are so, in some cases, so deep, so intertwined, so complex, and the differences between them so irreconcilable that this is a very complicated part of the world. But what possibly lulled us into that, false sense of security is what was achieved in Western Europe after 1945. And this was obviously with the investment of the United States in the security of Europe, that we did create structures, and be it through NATO and indeed the European Union, where countries were able to have extraordinary levels of interaction and cooperation. And in NATO, they call this the habits of cooperation, where establishments were so focused on working together that the traditional differences and rivalries faded into the background. It doesn't mean to say they went away completely. You think about, my country's relations with France are not always straightforward, but they were very far from being hostile. Yeah. And it was that type of common framework that made it possible. So I think it was an absolutely worthwhile aspiration to try to include Russia in a security mechanism in which we had greater contact, greater exchange, and greater possibilities to talk to each other, and as a result, to trust each other that bit more. And we even saw in the 1990s in NATO's cooperation with Russia, some very fruitful exchange. But it wasn't to last. And the Russian system as a whole, I think, was very uncomfortable with it. Because if it cooperated, for example, with NATO, it then risked legitimizing NATO's role in European security. So we found that some of those Russian military officers who were part of those cooperative links with NATO in the 1990s, when they went back to Moscow, that their careers ended. There were even some suicides among those people because they saw no future for themselves. And to me, that was one of the very early indications that this notion that we can have integration with Russia were over-optimistic. But I think there are very few people who could have forecast that we would have ended up with such a rapid and violent disintegration of that relationship.
The last question, and sort of the most serious question. In Lithuania, we already have a German battle group in the NATO format, and within a few years we will have a German military brigade that will be deployed in Lithuania. In a scenario, if Russia were to take military action against Eastern Europe, do you think that there would be enough political will and enough public support in today's or tomorrow's Berlin and Germany as such for the use of military force against Russian Federation?
That is a big question. I would say today, German society is not prepared for this. And when the defense minister recently used the word in German, kriegstüchtig, ready for war, the K word, appeared in public discourse at that level, it caused enormous ripples. And the German leadership, the political parties in Germany have, I think, enormous responsibility now for preparing the society for the fact that we collectively in Europe, we collectively as members of NATO, have to invest much more heavily in collective defense because Russia poses a real danger. Now, this is in all the NATO documents, don't get me wrong, it's there, but it's not yet in the public consciousness. And let's face it, there are some significant pacifist undercurrents in Germany. And after all, after 1945, we were keen to turn Germany into a country that couldn't repeat the type of adventures it had embarked on during the Hitler years. So there's a good reason why the Germans are the way they are today. But having lived through 30 years of cutting the armed forces down to such a small size, where a lot of society believed that there was simply no prospect for fighting war in Europe again, the German public needs to, I think, relearn some lessons. So I'm confident that if that takes place, that if we were to ever reach that point, and I don't think it's something that's going to happen over the next 3 or 4 years, but you might say the next 8 to 10 years, none of us can predict the state in which Russia is going to find itself and whether it really does want to continue down this course and whether it can even sustain this course. I'm personally doubtful about that. I think the key question will be less, will the German public, be sort of better attuned to the realities of what's happening? A much bigger and, for me, more serious question is, where will the Americans be in all this? And that's something we need to think about very seriously. So I was struck today by the quality of discussion at the Lithuanian-German Forum about the future. The German side, arguing that at least some representatives that we as Europeans need to go to Washington and say we are going to shoulder more of this burden. We need to keep together, and let's not throw away this valuable organization. We're not at that point yet, of course, but with the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House, we have to, I think, contemplate all scenarios. But I certainly think, to get back to your question, that the German society is capable of learning that this is a very different environment in which different types of policies are needed to secure the way of life in Europe and to secure our prosperity. But at the same time, this is a country like others in Europe that is living through this period of upheaval, and there is going to be more upheaval. And you look at the way Germany has changed its energy mix, the costs that have been associated with that. These are having an effect on industry, on jobs, on the way people think about their futures, and therefore on politics. So we're going to see more of certainly the AfD, maybe other political influences. So this is going to be a bumpy period that we're entering. And it's most important that I think the German political parties, enter into this broader discussion with society about security requirements and how those security requirements can be met.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John, Mr. Lough. Thank you very much for your time, for your insights. This was the podcast, The Right Mind. I just want to remind you that our today's guest was John Lough, Associate Fellow of the Russian Eurasia Program at the Chatham House, and the author of a book called Germany's Russia Problem, which I highly recommend to you, dear listeners, to check and to read. It is indeed a very insightful book. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.